In Florida, there were segregation laws that prohibited blacks and whites from sharing the same restaurants, hotels, and other public places, including the baseball field. Robinson was forced to stay in a coloreds-only hotel. It was believed that there would be a greater chance of Robinson being integrated into the minor league in the more liberal and open environment of Canada. Eventually, Robinson played his way into the major league. However, the transition was not a smooth one. In the first year, he had many pitches thrown his way and was regularly taunted by fans and players. However, his season was a successful one, and he was voted Rookie of the Year. Robinson's major league career lasted 10 years. Despite his initial success in breaking the color line in baseball, it would take many decades before there would be complete acceptance of black players. To this day, there is underrepresentation of blacks in management and coaching positions in baseball. Robinson died in 1972. His headstone bears an epitaph that he wrote, "A life is not important except in the impact that it has on other lives."
Woods. One of the most dramatic moments in golf occurred on April 13, 1997. On that day, Eldrick Tiger Woods, at the young age of 21, won the prestigious Masters Golf Tournament. Not only was Woods the youngest ever to perform the feat, Woods' score of 270 set a record for the tournament. His victory was also seen by many as a symbolic victory over years of racism in the sport of golf and U.S. society in general. Woods' victory in 1997 came just 2 days after the 50th anniversary of the day American baseball players broke the color barrier in professional baseball. Also, Woods' victory came in a sport long recognized for racial exclusion. The Augusta National Golf Club excluded blacks from playing in the Masters tournament until 1975, and the Professional Golfers Association only removed its Caucasians-only rule in 1961. Woods was born in the state of Florida in 1975. He rose to fame quickly, winning the U.S. Amateur Tournament from 1994 to 1996, National Collegiate Athletic Association Champion in 1996, and U.S. Junior Championship from 1991 to 1993. In the first year that Woods turned professional, it is estimated that over $650 million U.S. in extra revenue was generated in golf. Television ratings soared in the sport, and the Professional Golfers Association negotiated huge contracts with American television networks as a result of Woods' fame. Woods has also negotiated record-breaking private sponsorship deals with major firms such as Nike, Buick, Titleist, American Express, and many others. In fact, Woods negotiated deals in the millions even before he turned professional. Truly an international sports celebrity, Woods sees himself as someone destined not only to be a great athlete, but also a person who will have some significant social or political impact on the world. It is not clear, however, what that impact will be, but there is little question that he will be one of the, if not the, richest athletes in history. Woods is destined not just to be a multi-millionaire, but a billionaire. Heralded by some as the first black champion in a traditionally racially secluded sport, he has also been received more cautiously by those who see the limitations of using black sports stars as role models for youth. Only a tiny fraction of African Americans have even the remote chance of becoming sports stars in any sport, especially golf. The odds, in fact, are so small that there is a much greater chance of winning a lottery. However, by some accounts, as many as 80% of African American youth aspire to make a living from playing sports. Meanwhile, 45% of African American children live below the poverty line in the U.S. If the trajectory of Woods' career continue on its current path, it is possible he will satisfy his father's wishes for Tiger, to make an impact on the world. It will be spiritual and humanitarian, and it will transcend the world of golf. Globalization and sport. One of the most recognized and widely debated terms in recent times is globalization. While there is little consensus as to what it actually is, there is little doubt that the world has in one way or another become more interconnected. Mass communications and transportation technology, in addition to the rise of transnational corporate culture, have combined to produce a new global culture. At the same time, sport has become one of the most recognized elements of global culture. In fact, it has been claimed that there are no other events in the world that attract the attention of more people around the world than sports events, especially the Olympic Games and the World Cup football soccer tournament. It is difficult to think of other events that attract the world's attention in the same manner as sport. Global themes infuse international sporting events in several ways. One of those ways is in advertising. Major transnational corporations using major events like the Olympic Games advertise with global themes and images. In addition, media coverage of major events often emphasizes national and international themes. These themes can be both positive and negative. For example, sport can reinforce international cooperation and cultural learning, but it can also be used to reinforce themes of aggressive nationalism and create tension between countries. This was clearly the case during the Cold War from World War II to the late 1980s, in which West Bloc and East Bloc nations regularly did battle at the Olympic Games. More recently, additional global themes have appeared. The international immigration and movement of athletes is one theme. Increasingly, professional and elite amateur athletes are attracted to other. Football, soccer, is one sport that practices athlete immigration frequently. Many professional teams in Europe, for example, have many players from outside the team's nation. An additional global theme that has appeared lately is sport used for international advertising and marketing. Sport provides a very useful device for transnational marketing and advertising because the symbols provided by sport are often recognizable internationally, and sport provides many of the themes and images important to advertising. Speed, strength, competition, perseverance, and so forth. Many corporations such as IBM and Coca-Cola regularly use sport to advertise their products, even though these corporations don't sell sport-related products directly. Some critics have claimed that major international events such as the Olympic Games are being used less for international understanding and cultural sharing as they are for making big corporations a lot of money. While it is clear that the sport-related images and symbols used by these corporations are recognized worldwide, it is not so clear what positive benefits are accrued from this. In any case, there is little doubt that sport will continue to play a vital role in the globalization process. International Olympic Committee. The International Olympic Committee, IOC, was formed in 1896 to govern the organization and development of what were understood to be a modern version of the Greek Olympic Games. Its first president was Dimitros Vikalis, a Greek, and its secretary was Frenchman Pierre de Coubertin. De Coubertin's energy and his vision have been the true inspiration behind the modern Olympic movement. The IOC has effectively governed the Olympic movement for over 100 years. However, that period of time has seen many conflicts and controversies within the IOC and in the Olympic movement as a whole. At first, the main obstacle de Coubertin faced to creating an international Olympic movement was the lack of organization of sport internationally. Early sports organizations, most of them amateur, had trouble organizing their own sports and leagues nationally. As a result, cooperating with the IOC internationally was an extreme challenge. In the early years, de Coubertin's own vision for the Games dictated much of the IOC's policies and procedures. His prejudices also influenced the movement. For example, de Coubertin was adamant in his rejection of female athletes' participation in the Games. An embodiment of Victorian ideals and prejudices, de Coubertin thought women's place was in the home and bearing and raising children. Indeed, he thought of women's competition as unnatural, immoral, and indecent. As a result of de Coubertin's powerful position within the IOC, it would take many years to have women participating in any significant way. The IOC has always claimed a hands-off approach to political struggles and controversies surrounding the Games, claiming, now for over 100 years, that the IOC is not a political organization and that the sport in its purest sense, one represented best by the IOC of course, is inherently non-political. The IOC has always had trouble answering critics who point out obvious exceptions to the claim. At the simplest level, the act of competing under national flags, something the IOC encourages, is a political event. At a higher political level, the Olympic Games have been used for political demonstrations through boycotts, and the Olympic movement was probably the most visible means of symbolically fighting the Cold War. The post-World War II years were lean ones for the Olympic movement. The IOC and hosting cities and nations often had trouble breaking even. At its worst, the Games went into great financial debt, most notoriously in the Summer Games in Montreal in 1976. However, since that time, the Games have taken a more market-friendly approach, encouraging private sponsorship and negotiating massive television contracts with networks around the world, especially those in the USA. As a result, the IOC is a much more financially solvent organization than it was a few decades ago. However, it is not clear that the IOC is following its founder's original plan for the movement. After all, de Coubertin was a pure amateur at heart. The current commercially oriented Olympics would make de Coubertin concerned, to say the least. Women in sport. The struggle to attain equality for female participation in sport has been a long and hard-fought one. 100 years ago, a majority of people, many women included, would have thought it unnatural, if not immoral, to permit women to participate in sports. Today, women's participation is widespread and accepted by most. However, there are still many sports and sport-related institutions and organizations that have not achieved full equality. Some sports, such as football or boxing, encourage very little female participation, although even these so-called masculine sports are changing. Women's boxing, for example, will probably be included in the Olympic Games by the end of this decade. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, when sports and physical education programs were first organized in North America, women were forbidden from participating for so-called scientific or medical reasons. Physicians as a group often spoke out against female athleticism, using the argument that physical activity would damage reproduction. Others claimed that it was quite simply unnatural for women to participate in sports. Little real evidence was provided to support these claims. In truth, the so-called evidence was more a reflection of physicians' cultural assumptions about women's place in society in general. The 1920s and 1930s witnessed a short golden age in women's sports. Individual athletes and teams or leagues formed to support female athletics. Track and field, tennis, softball, programs in physical education, and other activities were encouraged, at least for those women lucky enough to have the time and money to participate. There was even a women's Olympic Games movement in the 1920s and 1930s. At one point, the regular Olympic Games organized by the International Olympic Committee, IOC, became concerned that the Women's Olympics would gain enough power to challenge the superiority of the IOC's Olympics. As a result, the IOC included a few more women's events in their games, although not many. The golden age of women's sports was followed by a long drought. The post-World War II era was one of very conservative traditional family values in North America. However, in the 1970s, the current boom in women's sports began. One of the driving forces in the movement was East Bloc countries, particularly the Soviet Union and East Germany, both of which encouraged female athletes at the highest level, the Olympic Games. Female athletes with strong and muscular bodies emerged on the international sports stage. At first, this raised concern among the male-dominated sports establishment. However, after years of struggle, the muscular and strong female athletic body has become common in international sport. In the late 19th century, the founder of the modern Olympic Games, Pierre de Coubertin, said that the sight of women participating in sport was an affront to the human eye and unnatural. We've come a long way since then. Bjorn Borg. The professional career of tennis player Bjorn Borg was one of the most interesting ones in recent sports history. Borg's success in his sport came at an early age. Borg won Wimbledon when he was only 20 years old. However, by the time he was 26 and in the prime of his career, Borg inexplicably retired from professional tennis. Borg, who began playing tennis at the age of 9, was the number one ranked junior player by the age of 14 and had won the Italian and French Open titles at the age of 18. These were the first of several major championships won by Borg in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Probably his greatest achievement was a winning streak at Wimbledon that spanned 5 years. Between the years 1976 and 1982, Borg enjoyed almost complete dominance in competitive tennis. His retirement in 1983 then was a bit of a puzzle. Although his tennis skills waned somewhat in the previous year, he was still one of the top players on the tour and only 26 years old. Even stranger was the fact that Borg refused to reveal the reasons for his retirement. Following his retirement, Borg encountered a number of personal problems, which kept him in the media spotlight even though he was no longer playing competitive tennis. 5 years after his retirement, an emergency hospital procedure saved his life. While Borg claimed he had food poisoning, it was suspected he had a barbiturate overdose. In 1991, Borg attempted to make a comeback on the professional tennis tour, only to fail miserably. His insistence on using a wooden racket at the time, when all of the world's top players were using synthetic fiber rackets, didn't help matters. At the same time, Borg's second wife attempted to commit suicide, and the couple divorced in 1993. Eventually, Borg disappeared into obscurity, and there is little news of his life today. These sad stories about the latter part of his career aside, Borg was an important figure in modern tennis history. He was the sport's first modern media star and icon. Teenage girls conferred upon him a status comparable to a rock star. His face adorned t-shirts and other merchandise, making him the most marketable tennis player in history. Borg's career was a catalyst for Swedish tennis players. Those who followed in his footsteps and held him up as their hero included tennis stars Mats Wilander and Stefan Edberg. Perhaps most important of all, Borg gave to the sport of tennis a degree of showmanship, visibility, and marketability that was used as a role model for the sport in future decades.
Title IV. In 1972, the United States Congress passed Title IV of the Educational Amendments. This instituted a law that would seriously affect all U.S. educational institutions' sports programs. The law specified that it was unlawful to discriminate on the basis of sex in any federally funded educational program. This meant, among other things, that boys and girls and men's and women's sports programs would have to receive equal funding and support under the new law. The law was passed in a time when feminist-inspired movements in many countries around the world were fighting for equality for women. While Title IV was a law directed at equality in education in general, it is sports programs that received the most attention. This was perhaps because of the visibility of sports and the prominent place they play, especially in American post-secondary education. Initially, Title IV met with mixed reviews. Especially vocal in opposition to the law were those who had a lot invested in men's sports programs in the bigger educational institutions. Also, those that had administered male sports programs for years felt that the changes necessary to conform to Title IV's standards would be difficult and expensive. In the aftermath of Title IV, a battle emerged between the National Collegiate Athletic Association, NCAA, and a group that had administered women's sports, the Association of Intercollegiate Athletics for Girls and Women, or AIAW. The NCAA had avoided equalization for years, being devoted almost exclusively to men's sport. In fact, it was in opposition to the NCAA that the AIAW formed in the first place. However, with federal funding now legally devoted to equalization, the NCAA made an about-turn and suddenly supported equalization. In what many consider to be an obvious and unfortunate power move, the NCAA absorbed the AIAW. The long-term effects of this move were to wrestle control of women's sport out of the hands of women. The AIAW was administered by women for women. However, with the takeover, the administration of women's sport fell into the hands of men. Title IV did not manage to equalize funding between the sexes, at least not at first. The legislators of Title IV probably couldn't imagine the resistance to equalization in sport that would emerge, nor did they probably realize the extent of male privilege in school sport, especially at the upper, more elite levels. Almost 30 years after the legislation, there is still not equalization in many cases, although an increasing number of schools have fallen in line with the law. Today, women's sport has achieved a much higher level of respectability and support in schools. However, there is still resistance to complete equalization, and female supportive administrators continue to fight legal battles in support of girls' and women's participation in sport. Fosbury flop. American athlete Dick Fosbury devised the high jump technique known as the Fosbury flop. His new technique revolutionized one of the oldest events in track and field competition. While Fosbury never broke the world record using his new technique, other high jumpers were inspired by his gold medal at the 1968 Summer Olympic Games in Mexico City, where he introduced his new jumping technique. Fosbury was born in 1946 in Oregon and went to Oregon State University. He won the gold medal in the Olympic Games at the very young age of 21. It was assumed that his odd-looking new method for clearing the bar was based on a careful study of the physics and biomechanics of high jump technique. However, Fosbury claimed it was the product of pure intuition. Prior to Fosbury's invention, most high jumpers used a straddle technique. In this older style of jumping, the front leg led the jumper up and over the bar in a face-down position. Fosbury's technique involves approaching the bar in a curve with a last-second acceleration. Then, at the point of takeoff, the body rotates, positioning the back to the bar and leaping backwards. The head faces the sky as the body arches over the bar, with the mid-body and legs trailing behind. Fosbury had begun experimenting with the new technique when he was only 16 years old. In a meet in 1968 in which Fosbury used the new technique, a local newspaper's headline read, "Fosbury flops over the bar." Thus, the name of the newly invented technique was born. Since Fosbury's competitive days, his technique has been widely copied. Once experienced jumpers mastered the technique, records started to fall in the sport, due mostly to the Fosbury flop, but also to better equipment and running surfaces. Dick Fosbury will always be known for his revolutionizing of the sport of high jump. Free agency. Free agency refers to the ability of athletes to negotiate their own contracts and working conditions in professional sport. Before the 1970s, most professional sports had some sort of reserve system for athletes. In their reserve systems, players were forced to play for a single team, usually for the duration of their careers, under the conditions set by the team owner and the league bosses. Historically, the sport of baseball had the most notorious reserve system, which had been intact and strictly enforced for decades. The purpose of the reserve system was to allow owners of professional teams to control the movement of players and reduce their salaries. By being forced to play for only one team, players had little choice but to accept the contractual terms and conditions set out for the player. The player, in short, did not have the freedom to offer and negotiate his services on the open market, as is done on all other industries. This significantly reduced owners' payroll expenses and increased profits greatly. In North America, the major professional leagues in the sports of baseball, football, hockey, and basketball all had some form of reserve system. Flood did not win the case. A series of subsequent legal decisions made it apparent that baseball owners had unreasonable control over their laborers, the players. The Baseball Players Union became more militant as a result of the Flood case. In 1976, a court decision granted players free agency and the right to negotiate the conditions of their labor services much more freely than they had in the past. The move to free agency changed the character of the relations between professional sports clubs and their owners. Previously, owners worked or colluded together to limit the movement of players. Professional sports clubs acted like a well-organized club. Free agency meant a more competitive environment for players, and of course, players' salaries have risen substantially as a result. Today, sports fans often complain that players' salaries are too high. While certainly at times it seems difficult to justify the huge salaries of today, it should be kept in mind that before the current era of free agency and big contracts, players barely made a subsistence wage and often worked under conditions of servitude. The situation now might be less than perfect, however, it's certainly a vast improvement.